was talking about Psalm 46 leading up to all this and bringing in this idea that we are the rivers. Not there is necessarily. There is. Yes, there is. And it's right here. It's when you realize the river that's within. So I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. But we got some ideas that I want to throw out here. But Wednesday night when we were having the discussion, AJ asked me a question that I didn't know he was going to ask me. So I wasn't. It's not that I answered the question as fast as I do on the spot, because it's mostly conversational. Things that we're doing on Wednesdays, it's a lot of conversation. But he asked me, because we start talking about this stuff and we use a lot of times, and it sounds almost like a pejorative when we do it, or sounds like we're denigrating social orders or structures and things like that. And that's not really what we want to do. It's not what we want to. We want to sound like we're casting people out or in any way whatsoever, because that's not what Jesus does. And it actually goes the complete opposite of everything that we're preaching. Everything is inclusive. Everything's in the whole, the whole being. It's within the wholeness of you. But he asked me this question, and he said, from the negative standpoint, the negative context, what is your idea on religion, or what is your take on it, and how would you even define it? And I gave that answer of something that would eventually got to this point where it's something that clouds God, or clouds the love of God in any way. And to me, that's really what it is. It comes down to something that would try to put a shroud over the love of God. Something that would try to not make it clearly seen in any way. Something that would give you the thought that it's not out there, and that there's something that's not really beyond this cloud covering or this haze or whatever it is that we've filled it up with. And it made me think of something from the Lord of the Rings, where in the Lord of the Rings, it's getting down, it's in the Return of the King. And Tolkien writes it down for Frodo, who's carrying this burden, this heavy weight of carrying this ring of power that he knows he has to destroy. Trying not to get tore up already. Good Lord. He knows he's got to destroy this ring of power, which is another reason we sort of changed one of the lines in one of the other songs. It's not about a champion of heaven. It's a risen son of heaven, because God doesn't look like a God of power. God doesn't look like this God that's omnipotent and in control of everything, and he's just organizing all this other stuff. That's once you start doing that, you go down a rabbit trail of, okay, what about this? What about my life not working out? What about my pains? What about my sufferings? If you're so in control of everything, that's a whole other topic. But then Frodo's got this ring of power that he knows he has to destroy, and he's been chosen to do it. This small person, this something that would be seen as weak or foolish because of where they're from, living in the Shire. They're not really considered. They're not warriors. They're small. They're not somebody that you would call on to be somebody that would do something like this, a task like this. But he knows he bears the burden. He bears the weight. And as he gets towards the end, the ring is weighing on him. And every time he feels it calling out to him to put the ring on, put the ring of power on, put the ring that controls all the others, put it on. And he keeps hearing the call to power. He keeps hearing the call to do something that he knows is just going to just put him in line with every other evil person. It's going to make me line up with every other evil action that people have taken over the years when they see the ring. Instead of destroying it, they've worn it. They've used it as power and used it to control, used it to do something that limits the flow or the stream of something in some way. And Frodo he's nearly passed out under the weight. And they've crossed over mountain, what was it? I wrote it down here just so I would try to remember. Yeah, they've crossed over the mountains of shadows, and they're in this valley. And while they're there in the valley, Frodo is nearly passed out from carrying the weight of all of this. And it's his friend Sam. It's his friend Sam, who's been chosen, another little weakling like him, that's been chosen to go along with him. Well, really not chosen. Frodo's the one that's chosen, but it's Sam that makes a choice. Sorry, I messed that up. Sam makes a choice and said, well, if you're going, I'm going. If you're going to go throw that thing into a lake of fire, then I'm not going to leave you. I'm going to go with you to make sure that you get there, to keep you safe and bring you back home. So Sam goes with him, and it's Sam who's the unsung hero in the story, because he's the one that keeps, it's almost like the Holy Spirit. He's almost like this figure that's constantly whispering, and sometimes not whispering, sometimes wrestling Frodo to the ground and telling him, don't do that. You're gonna ruin this whole thing for us. Sam is also like the Holy Spirit because he likes potatoes. Boil them, smash them, put them in a stew. It's any type of way you can have potatoes. So you know that Sam is representing the Holy Spirit if he's talking about taters. Yeah, you boil them, smash them, put them in a stew. And every time I see anything about taters, potatoes, I say it every time. Sorry, the girls hear it constantly in the house. So Sam is like this Holy Spirit figure who is constantly keeping him about the task. This letting go of this power, letting go of the control, letting go of this thing that's caused destruction in its wake. And everybody thinks they're going to do it right. Every person that takes the power, they think they're going to be the one. I'm going to be the one that does it right this time. Well, nobody did. So Tolkien has them in this valley of decision, or this low place. They've gone through the mountains of shadows, and they're in the wake, or in the sight of the mountain of doom, where the eye is, and he knows that's where he's got to throw the ring into the fire. And there's nothing but shadows everywhere. There's nothing but darkness because of this evil that's spread from Mount Doom. So there's nothing but darkness. But somehow, in the middle of the night, Sam, watching over his friend, and when I think about it, I think about you. You're such a great friend. We'll talk about that later. Trying not to get crazy and emotional now. But Sam sees, while he's laying there and wondering, are we going to get to the end of this or not? And wondering if Frodo's going to be able to stand up to the weight and be able to even bear this any longer. And suddenly, there's this little light of a star that shines, the clouds just enough part, just for him to see that there is a light. And he says that's when his hope had returned to him. It's the way that Tolkien writes it, that his hope had returned to him because he realized that the shadow was not permanent, that the shadow did not last. But even if the shadow remained, that there's something on the other side of that shadow that gleams, and there's still light that shines. There's still something that gives hope, and that if anybody could just look up and point their direction upwards, then they might be able to catch a glimpse of it. In the absolute darkest of night, you might see a little bit of light. You might see a little bit of hope. And it gives Sam the confidence and the courage to continue going on with Frodo to get to this final point where Frodo has to throw the ring into the fire. And that's where I feel like that's where I've kind of felt this week, especially after AJ asked that question and I answered it the way that I did about this, something that would shadow us or try to cloud away the love of God in some way, and say that it's restricted in some way, or that it's not for everybody. It doesn't consider everybody. And all of that kind of stuff, it makes me sad when I think about it, of how many conversations that we have with people who have been beguiled, and people that have been told the lie that they don't matter. Or they've been told the lie of separation, the delusion and the confusion that is inside of so much of Christianity. Because of that, every division, there's 400 and some thousand churches in America, almost all probably preaching something entirely different today. Everybody, we've all got our own thing, we've all got our own group, we've all got our own, you name it. And out of all 400,000 churches with 400,000 pastors in this country, preaching 400,000 different sermons today, you can imagine that some may sound similar, some may not, but at the end of it all, it's really comes back to union with God. It comes back to understanding our union with Jesus, our union with God through this person who realized his own divinity and his own purpose within. And sometimes when I look at all of this huge vastness of all of this stuff, it does sometimes disappoint me. It does sometimes make me angry and sometimes makes me worry and causes this thought of, will we ever do what Paul said? He gives the fivefold ministry for the maturing of the saints, the edification of people, and then that we grow up into the head. Almost like the head is already here, just waiting for the body to reach it. And it's like, will we ever become a unified group of people? Not a unified religion, not a unified doctrine, not a unified dogma, a unified people. That no matter who we're dealing with or who we're interacting with, that we feel connection with them, that we feel union with them. Now, that's something entirely different. But when I get these glimpses of things, like stars glimmering in the night through the sky, these little glimpses of hope from conversations that we have, from people that respond to us and people that are engaging in this sort of thing, it gives me that much more hope to continue on. If all I can do is be Sam to somebody to encourage them to keep going and say that we're not there yet, but we will. We'll get there. We'll get there. And not to put everything out there from a distance perspective, but to say that one day we'll all come into the unity. We'll be of one mind. We'll be of one accord. I believe that it'll happen. I don't know how, but I believe it. I believe that there'll be that awakening. Well, one of the things that I'd read this week in response to answering AJ's question was reading something from Paramahansa Yogananda. He's a yogi and a guru who was a spiritual leader and wrote a lot about Jesus. But he had written this down, and he was talking about similarly religion and how it is a means, how it can be a means of control. And what he was talking about was the religious leaders of Jesus' day. And how ultimately, he says, compared to the religious systems in Jesus' day, the system that he believed Jesus was dismantling, the religious system of that day, and he says this, that church authority, when exercised harshly, reduces its best teachings to a faint echo of the divine truth it proclaims. Water cannot flow higher than its source. When religious systems appoint themselves as the only source of truth, though in fact such truth as they've uttered can only flow through them, they block that flow. The teachings they promulgate as being the source wane the power of the truth from a mighty waterfall down to a little gurgle. So he's talking it and comparing it to the flow of water. And of course that catches my attention because of when I read that after, because AJ and I had this conversation from Wednesday night about the woman at the well. So let's talk about a couple of water stories that I like. But first, an artesian well. Anybody know what that is? You know what that is, right? It's when the water through an aquifer or aqueduct is built up pressure under the earth. And from the pressure, suddenly it reaches this point, or at least where it can find an opening, and burst. Finally burst and becomes a well. So if the water is not dug, if the water is not dug out and a well is not formed for something, then the water eventually reaches the surface. One way or another, somehow in the earth, the groundwater that's flowing through there, it builds up all that pressure with the bedrock, builds up all the pressure with the slate and the shale and all the rocks and everything that's under there, and eventually finds its way to the surface if it's not first dug out into a well. So think about that. Think about the water that is building up pressure and eventually reaches its surface. John chapter 4. John chapter 4, we don't have to read through a ton of this because we've talked about this story so many times, but a lot of it is worth repeating, and I'll probably do plenty of it in the mirror, just because of, man, I just love the way Francois puts so many things. We love him to death, and so blessed that we got to have him here and have some meals with him and talk to him, and just a wonderful person. And I remember when he walked in, and he walks up to Bishop and gives him this hug, and they just start crying. Like two guys never met each other, but they did. They've already met each other somehow in the Spirit. Like they already knew each other somehow. And it's like the same Jesus living in both of them, the same love and embrace. It just brought them together in that moment. And that's what it felt like with us. We met him and he just wanted to hug us, just wanted to embrace us. And I thought, good Lord, what if you just saw everybody like that? What if you did everything that way? I'll probably come back to that point anyway. But in John chapter 4, Jesus is en route going through this town in Samaria, and he sees the woman, or he's at the well, and the woman sees him and he asks her for something to drink. And she makes it clear to him that, well, you don't have anything to draw with. And he says, well, if you knew who I was, you'd ask me for living water. You'd ask me for a drink of water and you never thirst again. So she's like, okay, where's this water at? Tell me what to do. How do I drink it? And it's real similar comparison to like Nicodemus, who, when Jesus tells him, you must be born again. He's like, okay, well, what's the literal way to do this? He's like, no, the literalism is reading too much into it. You're not understanding it. If that's the way that you're going to try to interpret the scriptures as literal, you're going to miss the point. And that's still the case today. If you're going to try and interpret this anthology that has so many different points of view in it, if you're going to try and interpret it literally, you're going to really mess things up. And that's something that we officially need to retire in Christianity, is the literal reading of some of these texts, because it completely misses the point. But it gets them to this place in the conversation in John chapter 4 where he tells her that he is the living water. And that he is the one that is this source. And he compares it very much like a well. And not just seepage water, not just water that just simply flows, but something that's like an artesian well. So the water that's built up pressure over time and suddenly bursts forth. And that's the way that he begins to describe it to her. In verse 13, I'll read it out of the mirror. It said, Jesus answered her, this well cannot quench the thirst that I'm talking about. Anyone drinking from this well will thirst again. Whoever drinks from the source of this water that I shall give you will never thirst again, because the water that I give becomes an artesian well bursting from within, defining the life of the ages. I love that he puts that in there, defining the life of the ages, because he compares it with this Greek word eis, which is to be into, or indicating the point reached, a conclusion, or a defining moment. Now think about the defining moment. Her defining moment is this interaction right here that causes her to realize that, yes, he is a water source. He is an artesian well. And he's saying that he has living water bursting from within going out. Then he doesn't just leave it that she or that he is simply a source of water. What he's trying to get her to see is that you're a water source. That somewhere within you, over time, water has built up, pressured, and it's been building up and building up and building up. And finally, will it ever get to the place where it bursts forth? That's where I believe Jesus is taking her in this conversation. And when you follow it historically, this woman at the well, or Samaritan woman, and AJ talked about this, I think, last year. It's a beautiful thing to realize. If you look her up, find out that she's a woman whose name was Fatini. Fatini becomes a saint in Catholicism and in the Orthodox Church because of the story after this. This woman, and this is what blows my mind about this and how this gets warped so many times. But this woman has this experience with Jesus at this well, has this, what you would think is a chance encounter, but something that is, you could either say that it's divinely inspired or set up in the moment, or Jesus just happened to be at the right place at the right time, and Jesus did his Jesus thing, what that he does. But here's this encounter that she has that causes her to go back to her town, tells everybody in the town, come and hear of a man. And now we've taken this and we've kind of turned it negative. I want to try and flip that back around, because when you even hear the song about it. It's this old Southern gospel song. It's like, there came a thirsty woman, and so she was drawing from a well. And it's a beautiful song. And we grew up singing it, and I love that song. But then it gets to this point, then she met the master who told of her great sin. And I was like, okay, that's not what happened. Let's read it again. It's not about talking about her sin. Nowhere in there is it talking about her sin. A woman in first century Judea or Samaria would not have a choice of how she was going to be divorced or whether she was going to have 5 different husbands. Women were not in control of divorce during that time. So this woman meant that she was put away 5 different times. She was rejected 5 different times. She was removed from a home 5 different times. And now she's living with somebody out of desperation just to have a roof over her head, because who wants the woman that's been put away 5 different times for whatever reason it may have been? Here she is, this pressure is building over time. And I think that part of the pressure that began to build in her time after time after time with every rejection, every time she's cast out, every time that she's pushed away, every time that she was removed from someone's home, this pressure is building and building and building. All of this rejection, all of this pain, all of this suffering, all the difficulty that she's walked through in her life, it's building pressure and pressure and pressure until finally she meets Jesus at this well and begins to tell her that He is the water of life, that He is this water. And then He points to her and says the same thing about her, that the water has been building up in you time after time after time. Would you just let it burst? And it's exactly what happens. The woman goes back to her town. She preaches to the people and she says, come and hear a man who told me all about me. She didn't say in there, come and hear a man who read my mail. This guy, he's a real prophet. He's calling out sin and sin and sin and sin. Because that's what we put in our head. That's what these prophets are supposed to do. Supposed to be God, oh Lord, oh Jesus, help me. It's like walk into a church service and start. I can smell the sin in here. I can tell. It's like I don't know what you're sniffing on, but my God, dude, like chill out, because and it's almost always something. It's the same. The cardinal sins, especially of Pentecostal churches: sex, drinking, cussing, smoking. What else are they? Those are at least, drugs, I reckon. Those are I guess those are your top 5 right there. And it's like, all right, out of the most of the people that attend your church, what is the likelihood that there's that many people, especially in these small Pentecostal churches or a church like this? What is the likelihood that we've got some of the major things like that going on? But yeah, there is a chance. I get it. But at the same time, like these same preachers are preaching to the same old Bessies and Jims and Johns and Georginas, and preaching the same message. And I guarantee you, Georgina does not have a drug problem, but you sure enough get up there and preach about it every Sunday. I digress. But I think part of it too is like we get to the end of our bag of tricks. I know that that's just the way it is. We get to the end of our bag of tricks. We've preached all the sermons that we know to preach, so now I got to start preaching on sin. I love the way Brian Zahn puts it. He says, all right, you want me to preach on sin? Tell me your sin, and I'll preach on it next Sunday. I'll be happy to. Oh no, well, that's not what I meant. I know that's not what you meant. That's why I really love him. I think he's funny when he does that. But here's this song that is said, told of her great sin. But for her, she said, told me all about myself. Told me all about who I am. Realign me with the real me. Realign me with what Margie told us last week, because AJ got up to preach and he says, remember the story of the pearl, the parable of the pearl. Who's the pearl? Margie says, me. We got it. You're getting it. I'm the pearl. I'm the thing that he loves. I'm the thing that he desires. I'm the thing that he'll sell all that he has to get the field just to be in the same presence as the treasure. Because the treasure to him, it doesn't have so much monetary value, because you'd think that he's getting a deal. Finds a treasure in a field and he buries it. And he thinks, oh God, at least the person here in the story, He's going to get a deal on this field. He's going to go give the guy some lowball number and buy this field. He's going to get the treasure. Instead, he sells all that he has. He gives up everything that he has just to have the field that has the treasure, to be in the same atmosphere as that treasure. And that's the story of the kingdom. That's what Jesus says when he tells that story. The kingdom is like somebody finding a treasure in a field and selling everything that they have just to have that field that has the treasure. Not because it's more valuable than everything that they own, but because it has something in it that is valuable to his presence, being in the same atmosphere as that treasure. And here's this woman realizing it about herself, seeing herself. She goes back to this town and says, "Here, come and hear a man, not that told me about everything I was doing wrong, not that could read my mail and call out all my sin, but come and hear a man who told me all about me." The artesian well within her began to build up all this pressure, and finally it burst out until it cannot hold itself any longer. And this woman becomes a saint who preaches the gospel and ultimately dies in a well for preaching about Jesus. Crazy story. Fast forward a little bit to John chapter 7. Same book. A couple chapters forward. John chapter 7. Here's Jesus going back into town. And they're celebrating the Feast of Tabernacles, or booths. It's also called Sukkot. The Feast of Sukkot, or Tabernacles, was a harvest ceremony. And what it symbolized through all the days, you finally got to the end, and the last day, they celebrated the end of the fruit harvest and the beginning of the rainy season. So what they would do is they would pour out water. They would grab jars of water out of the Pool of Siloam. The Pool of Siloam has its own special meaning as well. They would draw water out of the Pool of Siloam, and they would sing Psalm 118, and they would quote Isaiah 12. And they would pull the water out of these jars, and they'd walk into town, and they start singing, "With joy we draw water out of the wells of salvation. With joy we draw water out of the wells of salvation." And they would take these water pots, and they'd pour them out as an oblation to God, or to them, well, anyways, that's another topic. They would pour out this water as an oblation to God, as an end of the fruit and the beginning of the rainy season. So it's this honoring God that you're going to give us plenty of rain this year, and our crops are going to grow, and here we'll be again celebrating next year the Feast of Tabernacles and Sukkot, and we will be able to sing the same songs again because you gave us a good rainy season, and rain makes corn, corn makes whiskey, and all that other stuff, right? So that's what it comes back to. Believe it or not, that's what everything reverts back to for them. So Jesus has a couple of encounters right here. Because in the story of John, the writer says that his family tried to forbid him from going, tried to keep him away, and don't go because they hate you. You know, people aren't in on the Jesus thing right now, and you need to stay home. So he goes anyway. Which proves that Jesus was stubborn. So if you want to be like Jesus, I'm going to be stubborn. So even when I'm told not to do something, I'm probably going to do it anyway. Because I'm like Jesus. What would Jesus do? He would do what he wants. Just kidding. Or am I? I need Juice here. Just give me a good hearty amen on that one. I believe he would agree with me. So Jesus, leading up to it, he has this moment in chapter 7, verse 14. It was about the midst of the feast. Jesus went up to the temple and taught. And the Jews marveled, saying, "How knoweth this man letters, having never learned?" Let's skip down to verse 20. Now, he says his little sermon right there. Don't read that yet. You can if you want to. I can't stop you, but we'll get to that in a second. And then in verse 20, it says, "Then the people answered and said to him, Thou hast a devil. Who goeth about to kill thee?" And then Jesus goes back into what he's going to talk about. But so Jesus walks up. They're immediately trying to keep him from going because they don't like him. He gets up to preach, and some people are like, "Oh, wow, how does he know all this stuff?" And it goes from these, that's verse 15. 4 verses later, they're like, "You got a devil, dude. Like, there's something wrong with you. We got to get him out of here. We got to do something about this." So that interaction happens and leads up to this point here, that on verse 37, in the last day, that great day of the feast, Jesus stood and cried, saying, If any man thirst, let him come unto me and drink. He that believeth on me, as the scripture hath said, out of his belly shall flow rivers of living water. Now here's what's interesting about this. Remember, they're pulling water in clay pots, in big jars, out of the pool of Siloam, and taking it and pouring it out on the ground as an oblation to God for the rainy season. And they're saying, we draw water out of the wells of salvation. We draw water out of the wells of salvation, and pouring the water out. And here's Jesus saying, well, if anybody wants water, the pool of salvation is right here. So to them, that's blasphemy, because the pool of Siloam represented something that was one of their favorite kings. And if you read where Hezekiah is mentioned in the scripture, whoever the writer of 2 Kings is, loved them some Hezekiah. He was greatly loved, and they saw him as one of the greatest kings of their time. So they talk about Hezekiah like he could do no wrong. And granted, you can see some of it here. When Sennacherib and the Assyrians were coming to surround Israel, and they were going to capture them. Or was it Judah? I think it was Judah. They're going to capture Judah. Here, Hezekiah has the idea, let's divert the water. That way Sennacherib and his army can't, if they don't have water, what are they going to do? We're in a rough desert terrain. They've got to have water. So if we take the water, we'll survive in our fortified city, and they'll starve to death. They'll have to bring in water from elsewhere. And by that point, it's probably not even potable. It's not something that can be drunk. So what they do is he digs this tunnel of Siloam, where the water would come to this pool. And it would give them an endless supply of water from inside the city, where they didn't have to go out. They had their fortress. They could stay inside and be protected and never run out of water. So the people saw that happen, or the people that would read the legend of that happening, like, well, this is our pool of salvation. That God inspired Hezekiah as a king to give us water, and now this is our pool of salvation. So if something great's going to happen, it's going to happen right here. And the thing is, they got so held up in an old story, got so hemmed in to say, well, if God's going to do anything, it's going to be within these walls of this city. And if God's going to move, it's going to be right here in this pool. So we're going to pour out the water, and we're going to say, all right, God, please give us a good rainy season, as we're pouring the water out that you gave us. And we're going to pour it out and believe that you're going to fill it back up with rain. So here they are getting caught up in this old story, this old tradition, and saying that if God's going to move, it's going to be right here. And it's going to be out of this pool. It's going to be out of this water. And then Jesus jumps up and says, don't worry about the pool. The water's right here. And if anybody's thirsty, let him come to me. And then he says something that you find very interesting. He that believeth on me, as the scripture hath said, out of his belly shall flow rivers of living water. Can you find that scripture? You know why? There's no scripture in the Old Testament that says anything about water flowing out of your belly. There's not a single verse in the Old Testament that says anything about water flowing out of your belly. So I don't really know what Jesus was quoting when he says that. There's ideas that it was Isaiah 55 or Isaiah 58 or Isaiah 42, and all of those match up great. They really do. But they say nothing about a belly. They say nothing about water coming from within. It's always God pouring it down, God causing it to rain, God causing a deluge, God causing rivers to flow, and all of this other stuff. But nothing that says anything about out of your belly rivers of living water begin to flow. But Jesus seems to have taken, let's say he does take that passage out of Isaiah 58. If I'm not mistaken, it was Isaiah 58. Let me go back to it. Where Jesus quotes that. Oh, man. Yeah. Isaiah 58:11, and the Lord shall guide thee continually and satisfy thy soul in drought and make fat thy bones, and thou shalt be like a watered garden and like a spring of water whose waters fail not. And you can see it there, making you a spring of water, making you some sort of a watered garden. But it doesn't say anything about the belly. Jesus is the one that's making the significance here of saying that the water is not going to flow from somewhere else. It's going to flow from right here. If the water is going to flow, it's going to flow from within and out. So if you take that John's theology, obviously, is that Jesus came to show us something about ourselves, to reveal something that is within. That this water that builds up under pressure, this water that builds up in difficulty, this water that has built up over time and all of the struggles, the temptations, the trials, everything that's gone wrong in your life, all this water that begins to build up on the inside somehow reaches its boiling point or somehow reaches this pressure point and finds a place of release. It finds a way where you let it out. And the water that begins to flow is not pulling water from an old well. It's not pulling water from an old stagnant place. It's not pulling water out of all of these old religious ideas. And remember, read that statement in the beginning of what Paramahansa said, that religion, when it's executed with harshly, when it's executed with power, it becomes something that can stop a waterfall and turn a waterfall into a gurgle. It'll restrict the flow. It restricts the flow. And here is Jesus saying, well, here's a way to not have the flow restricted to you. Don't go to them as the source. They're not your source. There's a source that lives within. There's something that lives inside of you that is greater than any source that's on the outside. And Paul would say, greater is he that is in you than anything else that's out in the world, anything else that is in the cosmos, the thing that's created, the orderly arrangements of mankind, that there's something that is greater within, not something so great that makes you above and bigger than everybody else. That's not the point. It's something that takes your greatness the same way that Jesus has this discussion with the disciples. And they put it off on James and John's mom. She's the one having the conversation saying, well, Jesus, when you get into your kingdom, can one of my boys sit on your left and one on the right? And then Jesus asked the two of them, are you able to drink of the cup that I'm going to drink of? Oh, we're ready. We're sons of thunder. We're ready to do it. Give us the cup right now. We'll do it. And the other 10 get mad. And they start murmuring amongst themselves. And Jesus is like, all right, we got to squash this right now. So he ends that argument by telling them, you're doing the same thing that the people of religion are doing. You're doing the same thing that the Pharisees do. He said, the princes take their power and they lord it over you. He said, but it will not be so among you. So for the greatest, the chiefest will be the servant. And the servant is doulos in the Greek. It's like this lowest form of a slave. So anybody with their greatness, with their intelligence, with their power, with their money, with everything, Jesus says the greatest is the servant to everybody else. The greatest, the one with all the capacity, with all the bandwidth, with all of that, they're the ones that become the servant to everyone else. So the recognition of the water within, the recognition of the well within, does not make us ascend. Remember, he said that water can't flow higher than its source. The water flows from wherever the source is. The water is not going to flow upwards. It's not going to flow against its own self. It's not going to flow away from its source or flow above its source. It comes from its source. So it's not about becoming higher than anybody else, becoming more important than anybody else. It's the simple recognition of the Christ that is within. It's the simple recognition that out of this house, the way that it's described, this house, that water begins to flow. Ezekiel 47. Ezekiel 47. Mostly well known. So Ezekiel is getting to the end of this prophecy. And they're going to start laying out, because Ezekiel is the prophet of one of the exiles, or of the Babylonian exile. In the time that he prophesied, the temple had been destroyed. They didn't have a location to worship God. They're not in their land. They quit singing the songs of Zion because they felt disconnected from everything that God had given them. From the place where they were supposed to feel hope, the place where they were supposed to feel this connectedness. It's no longer there. It's destroyed. So this is the time period. We've talked about this a couple times, but sometimes it's worth repeating. This is the time period when they began to have a different understanding and perspective of God, and they began to worship God entirely different. It was a reformation for them because they didn't have the temple, which was the place where God would meet them. They didn't have the land, which was the land that God had given them. They had nothing that would associate them with God because they believed God dwelled right there in the land. They didn't have a universal idea of God where God could be anywhere at all times. They didn't have that perspective. So Ezekiel is placing them into this mentality that God is there. It's one of the last things that he prophesies at the end of this chapter, the there-ness of God, Jehovah Shammah, that God is there. God is present. God is with you. But he leads into it with this prophecy that afterwards this guide or this angel brought him again to the door of the house. Now it's oftentimes translated that, well, this is his idea of the temple. But he says specifically that it's a house. This house. So think about that for a moment. This house. This house. Put yourself right there. And if it is a temple, Paul would tell you that your body is the tabernacle of God. You are the place where God lives. You are the place where God dwells. You're the place where He resides. It's right there inside of you. This house, this temple, this tabernacle. Takes him to the house. Brought me, talks about the gates, talks about this, and then to utter the gate by the way that looketh eastward, and behold, there ran out waters on the right side. And then in verse 3, and when the man that had the line in his hand went forth eastward, he measured 1,000 cubits, and he brought me through the waters. The waters were to the ankles. Eventually the water gets up higher and higher and higher. And by the time you get to the end of that point, the water is water to swim in. There's no more control of it any longer. You can't resist the flow. The flow is just there. The flow is happening. And now the water gets up to waters to swim in. And then he starts doing this with the prophecy. Afterwards he measured 1,000, and it was a river, this is verse 5, a river that I could not pass over, for the waters were risen, waters to swim in, a river that could not be passed over. And then verse 6 starts this beautiful description of what happens through this river's presence. And he said unto me, Son of man, hast thou seen this? Then he brought me and caused me to return to the brink of the river. Now when I had returned, behold, at the bank of the river were very many trees, one on the one side and on the other. Then said to me, These waters issue out toward the east country and go down into the desert. So water flowing to dry places. That's what he's trying to get you to see here too. Water that flows to dry places and then goes out into the sea. He brought forth into the sea, and the water shall be healed. And it shall come to pass that everything that liveth, which moveth, whithersoever the river shall come, shall live. Everywhere the water touches, every place that the water will get, he said it's going to live. Every place that the water will reach, it'll reach its deadness and will touch its deadness and bring it back to life. And there shall be a great multitude of fish. There'll be, because these waters shall come thither, for they shall be healed, and everything shall live whither the river cometh. And it shall come to pass that the fishers shall stand upon it from En-Gedi even unto Enagalim. Have fun saying that stuff over and over. They shall be a place to spread forth nets. Their fish shall be according to their kinds as the fish of the great sea, exceeding many. The miry places thereof and the marshes thereof shall not be healed. They shall be given unto salt. And this is where they talk about the Dead Sea. But what he's getting at is this point here. The river upon the bank, this river that everywhere that it touches heals something. Everywhere that the water flows, it heals something. And it becomes something that begins to flow out of the house. It flows from this home. It flows from the dwelling place. You are the dwelling place of God. I can't make that any more clear. But what it takes for us is this, going back again to sort of where we started. Religion, sometimes, and I'm not, like I said, I don't want to denigrate every religious institution. I don't want to denigrate every single Christian church or any other religion that's out there either. But so many times, if there is a group that says, well, we're the source, and if you're going to get anything from God, it's going to come from us. If God's going to move, it's going to be right here. That sounds a whole heck of a lot like John chapter 7. Sounds a whole heck of a lot like remembering the situations of Hezekiah or the greatness of Hezekiah. When there's someone that's greater, there's something that's greater that lives within. So you can hold on to the old stories of Hezekiah. You can hold on to the old ways of doing things or whatever it is that people have told you, well, if God's going to move, it's going to be right here. That's not the case. Yeah, God will move there, but that's not the only place where God's going to move, because that's not the only place where God lives. That's not the only place where God is living. God is alive in His creation. Otherwise, He could not be all in all. He could not be all in all if He's only alive in certain things or only alive in certain places. He would be some in some. Couldn't be all in all. We'd have to go back and rewrite the message of Paul. He would be... Hey, she's waving at me. See, let her voice be heard in here. I forget who said this. I heard this the other day. It's may have C.S. Lewis. If the child's voices are not heard in the church, or when the child's voices are heard in the church, that means at some point the voices of the church might be heard in them later. So let their voice be heard here so that maybe this voice might be heard somewhere else within them later on in their life. So yeah, bring your babies, bring your children, let them come in here and scream. If you heard anything that we've been talking about, it's about the childlikeness or being like a child. So let the kids come in. That's why they get up on stage and do all this stuff. Looks like a madhouse. To some it would. For those that want to institute control, which that happens to be what I'm talking about. So that worked out. That was a nice little distraction. Sorry, got myself distracted. But last night we went to see Josh and Caitlin, who had just had Charlie, and she's beautiful. She looks a lot like Caitlin. Josh sees a lot of himself there too. So let them win that argument whenever they at some point as she gets older. But we started talking, and Josh was telling me about some conversations that he's had because without being here. It's like, man, I've missed you. I haven't seen you in a couple weeks, and which is crazy that it's only been 2 weeks, but it feels like it's been a month already because of how many conversations all the four of us have, and sitting up here and doing this, and how fun it is, how engaging it is for us. And he said, I started getting into these conversations, and it's like this moment happened with him, where he said he felt almost like this, if you want to call it otherworldly or this heavenly or something, whatever you would want to put words on it to describe, but it's like channeling in all of these conversations that we had. Stuff that he didn't find or that he's maybe not read, but he's heard us reference. He's heard us say. And he said, I'm able to pull all of that, and it just starts flowing out of me. It just starts happening. And I'm like, that's what I'm talking about tomorrow. So I'm going to talk about the artesian well. It builds up all this pressure, so it starts to flow. But then the thing that happens, and the thing that began to happen in one of those conversations, is that he's met with the resistance, met with the blockade. Well, my education tells me this. My experience in the church tells me this. The years that I've spent here and all the doctrines and dogmas that I've been handed, well, they teach me this. And so blockade after blockade after blockade after blockade, trying to dam up the river, trying to stop the flow. But that's the thing about the river. The river will flow wherever it's going to go. It is so difficult to dam a river. It's so difficult to stop it and control it. It takes so much steel, so much concrete. It takes so much manpower and effort to stop the flow of water. And something began to happen in that moment that I believe will happen for every single one of us. That we have this recognition of the flow from within. That we realize that we're the source. And sometimes I think what happens for all of us, it starts out sort of like Ezekiel. I think some of us have had the Ezekiel experience. And some of us have had the woman of Samaria experience. Sometimes the water has built up pressure over time, over time, over time. I've been hurt, I've been wounded, I've been destroyed, I've been cast out by everybody and their brother, I've been put down, I've been ran through the ringer, or whatever in the world that you have experienced or dealt with in your life. And suddenly this woman comes to the realization of who she is, and it causes the river to burst out of her. Kind of like all those words just burst out of me like that. All of a sudden the river just burst out of her. But here's Ezekiel to people that have lost their religion. Literally lost their religion. They've lost their temple. They don't know who God is anymore, because to them God was connected to the temple. God was connected to the land. And here Ezekiel is seeing something, and the water just begins to flow gently out of this house. Man, goodness. The water just begins to flow. And suddenly the realization, the enlightenment, this otherworldliness. The water starts out as a trickle, and then it goes into this flow, and it becomes suddenly a river. And suddenly now, wherever the river touches, it's going to create healing. It's going to heal all the desert places. It's going to heal every place that it touches. When the water flows, and it flows from within. But what it takes is faith. What it takes from us is believing it. Because when we got to Josh and Caitlin's last night, Bishop showed up, and he was dropping something off to Josh. And so he called me over to his truck, and he's having a conversation with Brother Potter in Virginia. And he says, he said, listen to this. And so Brother Potter starts telling about that scripture where it's always touted as very negative. It's usually taken very negatively, but it's Jesus' response to the Pharisees anyway. So that's why you would imagine it would be taken negatively. But it's this passage where Jesus is telling the Pharisees and those that are in leadership or in charge or controlling people, saying that eventually the things that you do in secret, they'll be shouted from the rooftops. They're shouted from the housetop. So all this stuff that you're plotting and planning, it'll eventually make its way to the surface, and people are going to know about it. But what Brother Potter was taking, he's saying, you can't live another version of yourself. You can't live an untrue version of yourself. So if what's truly on the inside is this undrinkable water, if what's on the inside is stagnant, if what's on the inside is nothing but your pain and your suffering, or your attempt to control, or your attempt to manipulate, if that's what's on the inside, then he was saying you're going to eventually live your truest self. The true you will come to the surface, and it'll be shouted from the housetop. He said, but imagine living from a whole place, or a healed place, or a place, or you know that Christ resides within. Then your truest self begins to live out. Exactly the way that it said in Proverbs, as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. So if you think on these things, like Paul said, think on things that are good and holy and of good report, just, honest, all of these things. If that is what is on the inside, then when the river begins to flow, it's going to be a river of goodness. It's going to be a river of joy. It'll be a river of pleasure, a river of life-giving. That's what is going to happen, because that is what is within. But the step to get beyond that, it takes the faith to reveal it. Romans 1:17, Paul said that it's faith that reveals righteousness. Faith, belief, reveals the relationship. Because righteousness is taken from this Greek word diakosune, which is it's sharing in relationship and in bond, togetherness, fellowship. It means a face-to-faceness. So my faith, my belief in my face-to-faceness with God, and I don't even like doing that anymore because of what we've been talking about, how Jesus never called God God. He called him Father. Jesus had a relationship of a father to son, and that's what he shows us. He says, if you've seen me, then you've seen the Father. If you've seen me, you've witnessed the divine, but not the divine in the way that the Pharisees have told you that God is divine. They've told you and used the word Almighty and turned and manipulated the word Almighty into what it means as Almighty, but it doesn't mean Almighty. El Shaddai is not the Almighty God. When you break down that word, or you actually look it up in the Hebrew and Aramaic, you find out that it's referencing a mountain. And it's a mountain of two hills, and what it was the God of many breasts, the many-breasted one, this nurturer, the God of nurturing. So all of our ideas on power, all of our ideas on almightiness, it comes back to a God who is nurturing, a God who gives life and sustains life. All sufficient. Thank you, Margie. Get up here and preach. Good gracious. It's coming from this place of not almighty, powerful, going to just strike you down and destroy you. And that's the kind of stuff that gets everything twisted. But if you look at God as a nurturer, as someone who can provide life and sustain life with the very essence of that life, can sustain it, you see God entirely different. You see God from this place that's from the inside, where water can flow, where life can flow, and you have the faith to reveal the face-to-faceness. You have the faith, Romans 1:17, that faith reveals righteousness. My belief, what I believe about me, what I believe about God, what I believe about Father, what I believe about mankind, reveals itself in the relationship that I am having with mankind. And you can, I don't know if you've ever experienced this, but you come to church and you usually cannot hide this. You've had a dog fight with your wife on the way to church or something like that. An absolute blustering fight. You got all the guns out, knives out. Everybody's been screaming or hollering or whatever it is. You get into a fight with them. We've not had a fight like that, by the way. We're not violent people either, so it's like I don't really have those types of things. But you come to church in that relationship, you're going to say, okay, everybody smile, everybody clean up, everybody get ready. You're really, truly not going to be able to hide that. The relationship. I've had to turn around and go back home. I had to put her makeup back on after all that yelling and arguing and fighting. I had to go home and change my clothes. We've been sweating. We're duking it out. Love that. You're not going to be able to hide the relationship that you have. So if you have a negative relationship with your fellow man, if you have a negative view on mankind, it's going to reveal itself in the way that you interact. We're going to know your prejudices. We're eventually going to know the things that you dislike and the people that you dislike. It's going to reveal itself. Your belief, your faith, reveals your relationship. What you believe about people is ultimately revealed. That's what I'm getting at. That's the example that I'm using there. The relationship that you have with someone or something or some belief is going to be revealed because of faith. And whether we think that that's faith or not, it truly is. Because it comes back down to what I believe. What do I believe about this particular race? What do I believe about this political party? What do I believe about this person or this whatever? Put anything on it that you want, because the world's got plenty of them. And they always try to figure out which one you are by which one you include or exclude. Like, well, I just drew a circle around everybody, or I erased all the circles. People keep drawing circles to cut me out, and I just try to draw a bigger one and bring them all in the same circle again. I think that was, I forget who said that. One of those old preachers said that every time they draw a circle to cut me out, I draw a bigger circle and try and bring them in. And it just keeps us all together in unity. But that's because that's what he believed about them. For every person that would kick him out, every person that would exile him, go back to those messages, every person that exiled him, he had a different belief within him that caused him to include them even when they would not include him. That he would bring them into his circle. Faith reveals righteousness. And then if you fast forward that from Romans 1:17 to Galatians 5:6, Paul eventually says that faith works by love. The thing that gives faith its energy, the thing that nurtures and gives the nutrition to your faith is love. What did Jesus say? All the law, all of the first 5 books, all the prophets, everything that's in the old covenant, it hangs on this. Love. Love. He says, love God. Love your neighbor the way that you love yourself. So having love for God, love for my brother, love for myself, it brings me to a different faith. It brings me to a belief. And it brings me to a different way of seeing everybody. So if my faith reveals my relationships, what I believe reveals my relationships, and my belief is empowered by love, then that is an entirely different chemistry set that you're working with. You start removing the 5 different husbands from the Samaritan woman. You start removing all of her rejection. Hallelujah to God. You start removing all those pains. You start removing all the stuff. Everybody that's done you wrong. Everybody that's lied about you. Everybody that's caused harm. And all the abuse that you may have experienced in your life. It starts to pull all of that out of the chemistry set and say, we're not going to work with those ingredients anymore. Because what it creates is this putrid, nasty, repulsive thing. And you don't have anything good to show for after all that work that you put into the kitchen. All that effort. It's probably one of the things I hate most about cooking, when I mess something up. I spent all this time. I got the ingredients. I got the expensive steaks. I got the, you name it. I spent all this money on this, and I left it on the burner too long. You dummy. What were you thinking? It's supposed to be medium rare, and it's things like shoe leather. What were you thinking? But I don't really end up, that doesn't happen, right? I'll do okay. I'll do all right. I'm no Michael Hawkins, but I'm definitely no Michael Hawkins, but I can cook a few things. But that's probably the thing that I hate most is if I've done something, I've got all the ingredients and I'm excited about it and I've got all this stuff that I'm going to do and I ruin it in some way because I put the wrong ingredient in. It's like when somebody mixes up salt for sugar in their cookies. You're like, you spent all that time doing this and now you get this nasty taste when you bite into it, something that you're expecting to be delicious and it does not taste how it looks. Because cookies that are cooked with salt instead of sugar still look like cookies that are cooked with sugar. They still look good, but they taste terrible. It's not good. God starts taking all those ingredients, starts removing all that, and say, we're not going to work with that anymore. We're not going to work with you every time that you meet somebody. I'm going to start pouring out, well, yeah, I've been rejected 5 different times. This is the guy I'm with right now is not even mine. We're going to start removing all those ingredients and we're going to give you something else to work with. What's going to happen in this mixture, in this mixing bowl, it's going to be empowered by love. And now what you believe, your relationships with yourself, your relationship with God, your relationship with mankind, it's going to be empowered by love. We're going to put those ingredients in there. And what you believe will manifest. What you believe will come to the surface. You'll not be able to live an untrue version of yourself. You will live this truest version, and it just so happens that this version, this me, is empowered by love, not by my abuse, not by my hurt, not by my past, not by things that have gotten wrong, and not by the things that I've screwed up in my life. It's not empowered by that. It is empowered by the love, the all-encompassing, all-holding, all-powerful love of God. And that just so happens to be exactly what God is, according to 1 John. God is love. So the substance that God is even made of, if you can say that God is a divine theistic being, then what you get down to the core of this theistic being, what it truly is love. God is love, and love is revealed within us. So when the river starts to flow, it's a river of love. When the water begins to burst forth, it's water that creates love, and that love creates healing. Love, set right, begins to heal the desert places. It begins to heal the land that's been a wasteland. The things that have been destroyed, the things that have felt abandoned. And suddenly, water begins to flow. Love begins to enter the equation. When love enters into the desert places, when love enters into the dry places, you feel and experience something entirely different. And that's something that I think we recognize that. I think that when we experience that in relationships, when you fall in love with someone, or you're just experiencing brotherly love, kindness from someone, it rings true within you because it's something that you experienced in some eternal way. That God, the being of all beings, at its very core is love. So love got this whole thing kicked off. Love started it all. Love is what keeps it going. Love is where it will all end. Love brings it all together. And if there's anything out there, a religious system that tries to stop the flow of love, and it just tries to pull something that could be a waterfall into a little dripping faucet, then that is not where you need to be. That is not showing the fullness, the full picture. And it's love. It really comes back down to that simplicity, that it brings us back to love. It brings us back to love. And what eventually I believe we'll see is less of it being something that keeps us right here. John 7, the pool of Siloam, this is our water of salvation. And we keep coming back to this same building, the same way that they did. They keep coming back to the same place. We're going to draw water out of the wells of salvation when that's not the place of salvation. It's a really good story, and it's a really good thing that happened, and it saved those people in their time. It saved those people in their day, but it's not the end-all, be-all of where the water is. We're going to take the wells that are within, and we're going to let love begin to flow everywhere that we go. Let your love flow. She knows it. Sing it away. We're going to let our love flow. What that looks like is loving each other within here where it's easy. So this is the place where we begin to get familiar, comfortable, experiencing and expressing our faith, our love. Faith that is empowered by love. We let the river flow freely in here until we realize that we are the river. Until we realize that we are the river that brings gladness and joy to the city of God. Not just the building of God, if you want to call it that. Not just the central place, but the whole city. The populated place. It brings joy from the river of love that will flow. So that's what I encourage us all to do. So we'll end the stream, the live stream at least, by saying this: I love Him because He first loved me. But what I'd like for us to do is to have a moment while we end, or let's let this be the ending. Don't just get up and run out. Let's love each other. If somebody wants prayer, I'm not so special that you have to come to me for prayer. I'm nobody. I'm just Brent. And what looks beautiful is when we all pray